Well, good morning. We are glad that you guys have joined us this morning. We are continuing on in our series called Jesus is Better that has been walking through the book of Hebrews. And I, you know, we believe in vulnerability here. If you've been around long enough, you know that. But I feel all over the place this morning. I said this morning during kind of our talk through, I was like, I don't know if I'm here. Like, I don't know if I'm fully present this morning, but I trust that the Spirit of God is here, and hopefully He has something to say through me, because I don't have much. I don't have much to offer this morning, but I do believe that that God has something to say, and so I'm gonna trust that He will. So you guys can try to trust along with me. um, so as kind of a reminder of what this series has been about, the book of Hebrews is an invitation to see the whole scope of the biblical story culminating in the person of Jesus. Um, Throughout God's story, he chose to work through many people and reveal himself to the world in many different ways and to call his people to be reconciled to him. But there's only one that is, as Hebrews says, the shining reflection of God's own glory, the precise expression of his own very being. That's what the writer of Hebrews calls Jesus, the exact expression of his own very being. And so we've just been leaning into, all right, like, what do we make of that? What do we, when we say that Jesus is better than whatever else there is, what do we mean? What is what are the practical ways of understanding what that means for us? So our title this morning is "You Can't Go Back." You can't go back. And really what we're just going to be leaning into is, like, if Jesus really is the shining expression of God's own glory, if he is the precise expression of his own very being, if he is indeed God, then there's nothing to go back to. There's nothing that makes sense to go back to in terms of how we find our way to God, how we find our way to be reconciled with our Creator. If Jesus is the exact reflection, the exact expression of God, then all of the other ways that we have tried to find God, that humanity has tried to find him throughout humanity's existence, all of those other ways are worth nothing. And we can't go back to those. So let's dig in. Hebrews chapter 9, we'll start in verse 11. We'll read a few verses. We'll talk about those, and then we'll skip to another portion there in Hebrews 9. But let me say again that as we dig through the book of Hebrews, we have to remember who the letter to the Hebrews was written to. It was written to a predominantly Jewish audience who had come to believe that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. And as we read a letter that was written to a predominantly Jewish audience, sometimes it can be like way up here for us, because most of us don't have a very good perspective of Judaism. Most of us didn't grow up in that religion, and most of us didn't have, we just don't study it in depth very often. But we will do our best to kind of fill in those gaps as they come. So Hebrews chapter 9, starting in verse 11, says this: "But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, it is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciousness from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. Now, those of you who have been here for a lot of this series, maybe it's starting to come together. Maybe some of that makes more sense. Those of you who maybe this is your first, your first one or your second one, or you haven't been here for a lot of it, you need some fill in the blank here, right? Because this is an odd way to kind of start off this thing. We're talking about, the blood of goats and sheep, and we're talking about the tabernacle, and we're talking about all this stuff that, like, what is going on here, right? And essentially what the writer of Hebrews is pointing to is he's pointing to the sacrificial system. Now, the sacrificial system was established with the law. So we've talked about Moses quite a bit throughout this series. When God gave the law to Moses, think of it just in terms of the Ten Commandments. You're probably familiar with that scene where, in the old movie with, who was it, Charlton Heston or something? In the movie where he's given the tablets, and the tablets have these big stone tablets, and they have these 10 Commandments on them. Think of that, but also know that those 10 laws were not the only ones that Moses received. Those are the most prominent ones, but he also received a whole 600 plus more laws than just the 10 Commandments. And part of that law was this, okay, when we mess up, obviously, here's the 10 Commandments. These are things God wants us to do and not do. What happens when we don't do that right? What do we do when we mess up? What do we do when we break a commandment? All right, well, here's this system that's in place that will help you to be reconciled to God when you mess up, that will help you to be forgiven of your sins. And it was this system of sacrifice. It was bringing animals to a place where God is and giving God these things in place of your own life, right? I messed up. I didn't follow the laws that God put in place, that the creator of the universe put in place. I should probably, die, right? Most of us wouldn't think that extreme anymore, but you have to understand that people being introduced to the God of the universe for the first time, and all of a sudden he gives you these rules, and you're like, what do I do when I mess up? Does the God of the universe strike me down and kill me? Because that's probably what it should happen. And God's like, no, that's not how it works. There is forgiveness and restoration for you, but here's the thing that you need to do in order to experience that. Makes sense? Kind of. It makes sense on the surface, but then you hear the things that you're supposed to do, and you're like, wait a second. We're supposed to bring in an animal and kill it, and then sprinkle blood on. This is getting weird, right? It's important to understand, this was temporary. This was temporary. This is not, when God put this thing in place, this thing was almost like a placeholder for something better. This thing was meant not to be forever. It was meant to be, all right, this is God's perspective. I'm trying to establish a people who will show the world what I am like. In doing that, I need to give them a way to have a relationship with me that is unblemished, so that people can look at them and say, oh, these people know the God of the universe. These people represent the God of the universe. And so in God's perspective. It's kind of like, okay, I'm going to put this thing in place to give them away to me, but this isn't the complete picture of what it looks like to be restored to me. This is just a placeholder. And then B, I don't remember if I used A or 1, but let's just go with B. Did I say 1? Did I say A? What did I say? Okay. Nobody wrote that down? Come on. You're supposed to be taking notes, guys. So A, it was temporary, and B, it was symbolic. This was a symbolic thing. It wasn't something that in and of itself accomplished something. It was something that was meant to put people's hearts in a place where they saw what was going on and saw the spiritual significance behind it, not the physical act itself. Does that make sense? So the physical act was meant to point to a spiritual truth. Now, we'll get really a lot further into this in a moment, but I want to start off with this kind of truth that I think this whole passage tells us, and it's this: resist the urge to return to the comfortable. You see, the writer of Hebrews starts off by talking about this sacrificial system. He says, like, hey, here's what you guys have in mind of what it looks like to be restored to God. You have done this thing for so long that it's comfortable for you. It's comfortable for you to experience this sin in your life and then be like, oh, I know how to get rid of this. I go to the temple and I offer a sacrifice and I go through this ritual because it's comfortable. And the writer of Hebrews is telling this Jewish audience who has now experienced the love of Jesus, the saving power of Jesus, hey, it might make sense to you right now to go back to that thing that's comfortable. Resist that urge because you don't have to do that anymore. Can anyone relate to that? Maybe not to, the sacrificial system. I highly doubt any of you have performed a sacrificial ritual with an animal or anything else, but anyone? No, I didn't think so. So maybe not that, but this desire to, man, it feels like what I'm doing is missing what used to be in my life. It's missing this thing that I used to do that was comfortable, that was like ritualistic, that I was good at, it felt like it was doing something. And now all of a sudden I'm just supposed to have this faith that everything is done for me. It feels like I'm missing something and I need to go back to that thing that was comfortable. Can anyone relate? This is the thing that the writer of Hebrews is pushing back against. Hey, don't give in to that desire to go back to that thing, because that thing pales in comparison to Jesus. So this concept of this thing being a temporary substitute, in the creation story in Genesis, when God created humanity, it says that God was in the Garden of Eden with the people that he had created. With Adam and Eve, he was walking alongside them. He was with them. He was in perfect community with them. And then they fell. And that community was broken. That communion that they had was broken because they sinned. He told them not to do this one thing, they did it. The perfect communion that they had was broken. And so God eventually puts in place this sacrificial system, but it was a temporary fix for the brokenness in communion that they had experienced. There was a symbolism to it that helped direct people's hearts to a spiritual reality. And so let's talk about this symbolism for a moment. So here is the symbolism of the sacrificial system. Now, this is very, very surface level and basic, but hopefully it at least gives us a brief understanding. So the symbolism of sacrifice, one, it's people offering something valuable as a sign of offering their whole life to God. So when there were very specific instructions on what people would offer as a sacrifice. And in those very specific instructions, essentially you were offering something that was of immense value to you. You were offering the best lamb you had or whatever. You were offering something that was of immense value, but the symbolism behind it, it was a sign for offering our whole life to God. God's not asking for your life in place of the sin in terms of like striking you down. He's not asking that of you, but he's asking you symbolically that you would commit your life to him. And so in place of that, you're offering something that's of immense value to you. Second, the second piece of symbolism in the act of sacrifice, though we are spiritually dead in our sin, God will rescue us by accepting something in our place. Right? So we were spiritually dead. People are spiritually dead because of our sin, which breaks our perfect communion with God. And instead of God asking for your life, he will rescue you by accepting something else in your place. And then third, our present state of uncleanliness, right? Being sinful, it can be related to being unclean. In our present state of uncleanliness, that state is washed away so that we can start fresh, cleansed and fit for God's service. And so the writer of Hebrews is talking about this thing, and he's saying, Jesus did not enter the high place, the most holy place, by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood. And he says, the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of the heifers sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. Now this feels like a contradiction, does it not? How many of you would feel clean with the blood of goats and cows sprinkled on you? Anyone? Anyone feel clean in that position? No, like I would feel extra. You got to wash your hands when you mess with, beef, right? Ground beef. I got to wash my hands. I'm unclean. And this is talking about like actually taking the blood and sprinkling it on you, and somehow that makes you clean. It feels like a contradiction, but the idea, again, it's the spiritual perspective behind it. It's not the thing itself. It's the symbolism of the thing. It's being sprinkled with the blood and then knowing that that is a practical thing that you can wash off of you. Right? Like if you are covered in blood, that's a practical thing. Well, I'll just go take a shower and wash it off me. And in doing that, the idea is, okay, I am understanding the symbolism of being unclean and being made clean. Does that make sense? And so our present state of uncleanliness is washed away so that we can start fresh, cleansed and fit for God's service. Those three things on the surface represent the symbolism of the sacrificial system. Now, the writer of Hebrews uses that, and then he contrasts that with the sacrifice of Jesus. And here are the three things about the sacrifice of Jesus that nullify the sacrificial system and the symbolism that is in that. One, he offers himself as the most valuable thing there is. The most valuable thing in all of creation offered himself. We no longer have to offer the thing that is the most valuable to us because the most valuable thing in all creation offered himself. Two, though he was fully alive, as we talked about weeks ago, I think we talked about this in week 1, Jesus represents, he showed us what it looks like to be fully alive, fully human. And though he was fully alive, he died anyway, eliminating our need to do so. And then number 3, while animal sacrifices only made the worshiper clean on the outside, the sacrifice of the Messiah, the true high priest, has a cleansing effect that goes far deeper. We are, through the blood of Jesus, as the writer of Hebrews explains, we are not just cleansed on the outside, we are cleansed to our core, to our very spirits. It's not just an external wash. It's not just something that makes us look good. It's not just something that makes people be able to look at us and go, oh yeah, they've been cleansed. It's not just having clean hair or whatever, you know. It's something that goes far, far deeper. This reminds me when I hear this kind of description, it reminds me of Matthew chapter 23. When Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees were the teachers of the law. Like these people that Jesus has these kind of debates with all the time throughout the Gospels were the teachers of the law. They were the ones who upheld the concept of the sacrificial system. They were the ones who said, like, hey, here's how the sacrificial system works. We're going to enforce this. We are going to make sure that everyone goes to the temple and gets cleansed as they're supposed to, goes through these ceremonies and goes to the priest and offers their sacrifices. We're the ones who are upholding that thing. And Jesus has this portion there's this portion in Matthew where Jesus confronts the Pharisees and he essentially tells them everything that they are doing to put all of this weight on people's shoulders that is unnecessary. And here's what he says in verse 25. Matthew chapter 23, he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites." Yikes. "You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean." And then he doesn't stop there. He's got another one. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs." Anyone want to guess where that's going? Whitewashed tombs? "Which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." Ouch. Jesus is criticizing the Pharisees for very specific reasons here. And it's what we've been talking about already. It's this idea that, like, hey, you have this system in place, and you are sold out to this system. And yes, God put the system in place, but you are missing the symbolism of the system. You are just taking it at face value. You are just doing what it says, but you're not letting it affect you. You're not letting it change you. You're not letting it transform you. You're going through the motions. You're cleansing the outside, but it's doing nothing to your heart. It's doing nothing to your soul. It looks good on the outside, but on the inside, man, this is this is relating for me to a lot of the stuff we talked about at the men's retreat. Those of you who went and are here today, congratulations. I know it took a lot to get here. But this is relating to me for a lot of reasons, because a lot of what we talked about was this idea that, like, man, the theme was fighting shadows, right? And it was this idea that, like, there are things that we fight in our lives that really just try to put something between us and God. And we talked about like the concept of like loneliness. And we talked about the concept of just all of these different things that people deal with that put something in between them and God. And I'm, this line that Jesus says, like, on the outside, everything looks good, but on the inside, you're full of the bones of the dead. But it's more than just it's more than just a shock value thing. I mean, this is real. This is real stuff that people deal with, putting on a good face and pretending like everything's good, but dealing with just death inside. I could go into a lot of what we talked about up there. I'll refrain from that, but just it didn't hit me until just now how much this has to do with like just a lot of the stories that we were telling one another and a lot of the things we were sharing with one another. Just, man, like, we live in a world where people are experiencing death on the inside and putting on a good face. And I think this gets to the heart of what Jesus is trying to do here, right? This gets to the heart of what Jesus is trying to say. It gets to the heart of what the writer of Hebrews is saying about why Jesus came. He didn't just come to make sure everything looks good. He came to bring life where there was death. He came to take what was dead and make it alive again, resurrect it. And the sacrificial system, the old thing, the thing that was temporary, that was set up to make us realize the symbolism of what God was doing, that thing is not enough to bring life where there is death. Jesus is the only one that is enough to bring life where there was death. The sacrificial system reminded people that they were dead. It reminded people that they were dead in their transgressions and sins, and it symbolically reminded them that, hey, there's life in God, but it didn't do the job. Jesus did the job. He sacrificed himself. He gave himself so that we could not just know that there's life available, but experience that life. And so again, whatever it is that you may be tempted to return to pales in comparison to what Jesus offers. Whatever system, whatever religion, whatever ideology that you think might give you life, that you think might replace the hurt and the death that you've experienced in your life, might replace it with life, none of it will. It might remind you that you're dead. It might remind you that you need to be alive, but it will not do the job. It's a whitewashed tomb. It's a dirty cup. Looks good on the outside. But in the inside, it doesn't do the job. It doesn't do it. We're going to end with Hebrews chapter 9, verses 23 through 28. It says this: If it was necessary then for the copies of these heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices. So that Eden thing that we talked about, all of the temple worship, all of the sacrifices were copies of that. They were copies of having communion with God, having perfect communion with God. They were placeholders for that. And what the writer of Hebrews is saying is like it was necessary for all those things to be purified with these sacrifices. It was necessary for us to understand the symbolism of what was happening in the spiritual world. It was necessary, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands. There was only a copy of the one true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Before we get too far, I want to clarify that. There's this concept of the Day of Atonement. And on the Day of Atonement happened once a year. So the sacrifices in the temple happened often. They happened weekly. Think of it as like going to church. Go to church, offer your sacrifices. It happened all the time. But there was this one day where the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, the most holy place in the temple, and offer kind of the big sacrifice on everyone's behalf, right? And that was called the Day of Atonement. And so when he says here, nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. That's what it's referring to. Every year, the high priest had to do this. Not just one time, every year. And he's saying Jesus didn't do that. Otherwise, Christ would have had to offer himself many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many. And he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Now, last week we talked about this, we used this like wedding analogy. That when we're talking about this whole thing that God did in the past versus what he's doing now and what it kind of culminated in, we use this wedding analogy. Like we talked about this idea of like you're planning your wedding, you're putting all these things in place so that your wedding will be this perfect day, and then it happens, and when it happens, right? Everything that you do ahead of time is leading up to this one ceremony. When that ceremony happens, you're married. And it's this idea of preparation, that God was preparing something. And that in its completion, it was perfect. It was made perfect. It was complete. So we're going to go back to that wedding analogy a little bit here, because when we're talking about this idea of like Jesus doesn't have to offer himself again and again. He doesn't, like the high priest went in every year to offer the blood of the lamb, the blood of the sacrifice. Jesus doesn't have to do that over and over and over. Just like the wedding day. The wedding ceremony ideally happens one time, right? It happens once. You don't have to wake up every day and get married again, go through the ceremony again. One time. What's done is done. And so, as we kind of mentioned last week, if we're looking at the biblical analogy of comparing our relationship with Jesus to the bride and the bridegroom, if indeed we are his bride and he is the bridegroom, then when he completed the work, the marriage was done. It's complete. It only had to happen one time. He doesn't have to do it again. He doesn't have to go through this ceremony again. He died once and for all. And he was raised. And because he was raised, what it says here is, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time. Not to bear sin, not to get married again, not to do the ceremony again, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Now, this is where the analogy breaks down a bit. The wedding analogy, at least. But I thought of something this morning that I think might help us to understand it a little bit. We are eagerly awaiting his return. As his bride, we are eagerly awaiting his return. Now, I remember somewhere along the way, I don't remember if this came from like a specific like movie or story or whatever, but you have kind of this image in mind. Most of you probably can like imagine this thing of like, I don't, maybe like World War II or something like that, when like you hear stories of like soldiers are about to be shipped off to war and they get married right before they go because like I'm not gonna wait till I get back. I might not even come back, so I'm not gonna wait. I'm gonna get married before I go, right? And then you think of like, well, what about the bride in that situation, right? Like they're just there waiting. They're just there like anticipating, well, my husband's gonna come back. He'll be back. I know he'll be back. And they're waiting and waiting and waiting. And what is the mindset as they are waiting? They are anticipating what marriage looks like. Because they've experienced the wedding, the ceremony. They've experienced that, but they haven't experienced marriage. Again, this is not a perfect analogy, but if we are thinking of, okay, we experienced this wedding with Christ, where he came and he accomplished the thing that God was heading toward all along. He accomplished that thing. That was the wedding. And now we are in this place where we are waiting for the marriage. We are waiting for the time when we will be with him forever, experiencing life in his presence. I don't know if that helps a little bit to understand what's going on here. Again, analogies break down at some point, but hopefully that helps to put in perspective this idea of what's going on and where we find ourselves right now. Because it could be easy to think, if I'm putting myself in the shoes of a Jewish person who experienced Jesus and is like, okay, I believe that he was the Messiah, and yet I still feel this draw to be a part of this religion that I know. This is the thing that is comfortable for me. This is the thing that I know. And so I still want to do all of these things that I've always felt through my whole life that I'm supposed to do. But then people are telling me that like, no, I don't have to do that anymore because it's been completed. And if I'm supposed to see that as, okay, that was my wedding. That was my... Now I'm in relationship with this Jesus who died for me, and I don't have to do all that stuff anymore. But wait, where is he? Right? Like, I know that if I go to the temple and I offer these sacrifices, I'm experiencing something. But right now I just feel like I'm in this waiting place where I heard that Jesus did this thing for me, but then he's gone. How can I be assured that what he did was enough? This is the idea that the writer of Hebrews is confronting here. Like, I know it feels like things are not how they're supposed to be and that you need to go back. But you need to understand that going back is not going to get you the thing you are looking for, because the thing you are looking for has already been done. And now you are in this place of waiting for the finality of marriage. The biggest thing I want you guys to get out of this, the biggest thing I think we need to glean from this whole conversation, I don't know each and every one of your stories. I don't know each and every one of your kind of baggage when it comes to the thing that you were before you met Jesus, or the thing that you are as you're exploring this whole Jesus thing. I don't know everybody's story, but what I do know is that none of you would be in this space today if you were satisfied with what was before. If you were satisfied with whatever was before, you wouldn't be here. And I think about these Jewish converts to Christianity, and I think about what they must have been feeling like. Like, no, there was something about that whole system that it just wasn't enough. And I know that there's something else. And I think I've experienced that in Jesus, but what if I'm better off there? What if I'm better off going with what was comfortable? And for you, maybe it's just, living a good life and being good to the people around you. Maybe that's what was comfortable, and maybe that's what you are tempted to go back to, is just that, absent of Jesus. And I can tell you that it's fine, but it's not the best that the world has to offer. It is not the best of what is available. It is not a relationship with the creator of the universe. Maybe for you, it's, no, I've believed in God for a long time. But I believed in him in a way that was associated with all sorts of other things. Ideologies and politics and I don't know, you name it. Whatever it is that you kind of associated Jesus with, that maybe you're feeling like, that for some reason that just didn't do it for me. But this also sounds really hard, right? This also sounds really hard to accept. The fact that I can just experience the grace and love of Jesus without doing all that other stuff, that doesn't feel right. It feels more comfortable to go back to that other thing. I hope that what you have realized through this is that all of that other stuff is just stuff that might be able to point us to God, but it's not something that can bring us to God. It's not something that can reconcile us to God to where we actually experience a relationship with him, perfect communion with him. The only thing that can do that has already been done. It was the sacrifice of Jesus. It was him offering himself. And so wherever you find yourself, I hope that you will take this moment as we head into communion. I hope you will take this moment to really try and wrap your heart around what it means that Jesus offered himself. He offered himself in place of all of the other things that try to provide a way to completeness, to wholeness, to fulfillment. He provided it in his body broken for us and his blood spilled for us. He provided the way right here. So as we take communion, would you seek his voice? Because I believe that his voice is telling us today that he is enough. Not only is he enough, he's so much better. So much better than all of the other ways. And would you find that today in this, again, symbolic act of taking his body broken for us, his blood spilled for us. Even this is not enough. This is a symbol. This is a reminder. But it isn't the thing itself. This isn't the thing that saves you. This isn't the thing that cleanses you. This is the thing that reminds you that you already are. It's already available to you. Would you accept it and experience it today? Let me pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you for your body broken for us, your blood spilled for us. We thank you that it nullified all the things that we can do to try and make our way to you. It was you drawing near to us. It was you coming into our lives, invading our lives. Jesus, would we accept it today? Would we accept that you are better, that you are enough, that you are more than enough, that you are all of it, and that there's nothing to go back to. There's nothing to return to. All of the other stuff is unnecessary, and it pales in comparison to what you have done for us. Jesus, we love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. You guys come as you're ready.